Welcome to Pullback. I'm Kyla and I'm here with Kristen.
Heyo.
Each episode, we normally challenge ourselves to try something new in ethical consumption, and then we tell you what we learned, fuck-ups and all. This episode is a companion piece to our episode that came out earlier this week about Plastic-Free July. We were able to sit down with Sarah King, who is the head of the Oceans and Plastics campaign at Greenpeace Canada, to talk more about plastics in general, and she had a lot of really interesting things to say, so let's get into it.
So, Sarah, I'm curious to know sort of how you first became sort of aware of the problem with plastics and how you first sort of got involved with the fight against it.
Sure. So I actually started as an intern with Greenpeace in our U.S. Washington, D.C. office. Even though I grew up in Canada at the time, I was looking for an internship at an environmental organization, and the ones in Canada weren't offering opportunities at that point. So I applied to our US office, and that was back in 2006, I think. So when I came on board there, I was on the Oceans team, and I was kind of responsible for supporting the US-based Oceans team in whatever campaigns they were working on. And one of them was the Defending Our Oceans ship tour. And it was basically a ship tour where one of our ships was doing a tour in different areas, highlighting different threats to the oceans. And one of them was actually a visit to the Great Pacific Garbage Patch.
Interesting.
Yeah. And that was kind of, I would say, the first time that I really became more aware of the extent of the problem. I'd heard about it before that, but it was sort of my first introduction to really the extent of the issue and some of the major drivers of plastic pollution and the plastic waste crisis.
For sure, yeah. Wondering if you could, just for listeners that might have heard about Greenpeace before but may not know much about the organization, can you tell us a little bit more about what Greenpeace does?
Sure. So Greenpeace is a global campaigning organization. So we work to expose essentially the major environmental threats to biodiversity and to different communities around the world, hold those that are responsible for those threats accountable, and push for solutions, green and just solutions to these problems, and ultimately work towards a more green and peaceful future in all of those meanings. So no small task, but yeah, we really,
sure.
I would say we're most known for our nonviolent direct action approach, and really working to push for the needed change that we need across our broken economic system.
Mm-hmm. And I hope I'm remembering this correctly, but I think Greenpeace was started in Canada, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. Greenpeace was founded in 1971 in Vancouver, British Columbia, where
I didn't know
based.
that.
Yeah.
But now it's sort of all over the world. That's so great.
Yeah.
I'm part of the Greenpeace UK's mailing list. So every time they climb on top of a freighter or something, I get CC'd in those.
Oh, nice. Nice. Well, you should join the Canada.
I should.
Yeah. And then you'll know what's happening here.
Yeah, definitely. I don't know why I'm on the UK one, but not this one. That's silly me.
Well, Kyla did just move back to Canada.
Oh, yeah. Right. Yeah, I was going to say you probably signed a GP UK petition or something. And
I sure did.
Yeah. Nice.
That's great. Sarah, I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit about Greenpeace's actions on plastic, what sort of the general campaigns are.
Sure. So Greenpeace is part of the Global Break Free from Plastic movement, which is a very large, essentially coalition of over 1,000 organizations that are working to stop plastic pollution and waste at the source. And so Greenpeace has a global plastic-free future campaign, and Greenpeace Canada, where I am responsible for our oceans and plastics work, we are part of that global campaign. And so we really, I would say, where we focus our attention is on the major producers of plastic. And so some of the big players known as the fast-moving consumer goods companies, so the Cokes and the Unilevers and the Procter & Gambles of the world, we are pushing to have those major producers and polluters to move away from their reliance on single-use plastics and packaging and have them switch to reuse, refill, and zero waste, essentially, models of product delivery. And then we're also, taking a look at the overall supply chain, whether it's the food system or other goods. A big place where the consumer interacts with a lot of single-use plastics and packaging is also at the retail level. So with supermarkets, so we're also trying to put pressure on those major distributors and also producers of plastic packaging to reduce their plastic footprint and also move to these same models, reuse models, refill models. And then I would say overall, what we're trying to achieve is a ban, essentially a global ban on all non-essential plastics, on the production, sale, distribution, consumption of non-essential plastics, but really starting with the most problematic and unnecessary. And so those are the plastics that regularly end up in the environment. So, what we see when we do community cleanups or shoreline cleanups or in the images of plastic pollution, plastics that are known to be toxic to human health, plastics that, despite recyclability claims, are still, going to landfill. So there are a lot of different types of plastics that they say are recyclable, but really the reality is that very little, less than 9% of plastic waste is being recycled. And then lastly, plastics that we know have alternatives. So this is kind of the category of problematic and unnecessary plastics that we want governments to act now on to begin to eliminate from our lives and from the environment. So those are, I would say, our kind of major streams of work. And we do that, we tackle those goals in a lot of different ways. But a big piece of it is, actually changing the conversation around plastics and, really trying to counter the industry narrative that we need single-use plastics, that they're hygienic, that it's not a production problem, it's a consumption or an individual responsibility problem. We are trying to really bust those myths and empower people essentially to join the reuse revolution and join all of the amazing progress that is going on all around us with those that are working towards a more circular economy and a zero waste future, essentially.
Your work must have been cut out for you in this pandemic.
Surprisingly, no. I mean, there's still so much amazing momentum. We've definitely seen rollbacks by companies. We've seen pauses by governments that, we're supposed to be moving towards ban on certain single-use plastics. But there still is a ton of momentum. There's still, a lot of businesses that are operating with their reuse or refill models that haven't, relied back on single-use plastics. But definitely the industry has gone on the offensive and they're really pushing, especially the hygienic talking point right now. And we've seen an increase in plastic waste and plastic consumption and plastic pollution in different forms during the pandemic. But at the same time, we've also seen polling in terms of people's desire to continue to move towards bans on single-use plastic. We've seen the numbers go up from even last year. So there's still a lot of enthusiasm to break out of our, plastic obsessed lives.
Oh, that's so good. Some positive news on our podcast for once.
I know, it's so rare.
Yeah, it feels like people really care about single-use plastics, but it's just such an overwhelming problem. I was wondering whether you might be able to tell me a little bit more about, if you were to break down what the problem with the environmental problems with plastics are. Could you maybe explain that for someone that might not be already on board?
I guess to start at the beginning, 99% of plastic is made from fossil fuels. So it's being extracted from the ground. And so because it's coming from a fossil fuel, from extraction all the way through to production of the plastic itself, to consumption, disposal, and even once it's pollution, even once it's like in the actual environment, it emits harmful greenhouse gas emissions that whole time. And it also pollutes at every single stage of its life cycle. And through its pollution, it's contributing to negative health impacts on adjacent communities. It is harming wildlife, it's creating air pollution, it's creating water pollution. It is really negatively impacting everything that it's interacting with, honestly. So I think most people listening would be most familiar with the impacts on the marine environment in our oceans and on ocean wildlife. Probably many of us have seen the images of a whale with plastic in its stomach that's washed up on shore, or the seabirds that have ingested bottle caps, and the sea turtle with the straw in his nose. Those are, I think, what most people are familiar with. But what people are less familiar with are the beginning of the plastic story, like the extraction of fossil fuels, the production, the petrochemical production, the pollution associated with that, and how often these developments are in lower income, marginalized communities, and they are disproportionately negatively impacted by the production of the components that go into that same, chip bag that you're purchasing at the store. And so, really, it's an issue that plastic is an interesting issue because it really does touch on so many of the different environmental and social justice crises that we are facing today. Biodiversity crisis, oceans crisis, climate crisis, environmental racism. It really touches on all of these different issues. And it's interesting because it is also something that is in our daily lives, and I think most people, once they start to learn about plastic waste and plastic pollution, and kind of look around, and they're usually in their kitchen, mostly, they're like, wow, actually, it's everywhere. And so much of it really is unnecessary. And I think it's a really interesting way too for people to enter into the conversation about the climate crisis as well. It's a good entry point when people start to make that connection to that, plastic pollution is essentially another form of a sort of a solid oil spill. Yeah, it's, from the pollution that we see in images to the less visible forms, and increasingly the studies that are coming out that microplastics. So I guess just to take a step back, plastic doesn't really biodegrade in the sense that we would think. It breaks down over time, and it breaks down into tiny, tiny pieces known as microplastics or nanoplastics. And those little plastics are more easily spread through the environment. And so we see it spreading into food chains, into our drinking water, into the air we breathe. And that's another way that pollution from plastic is actually spreading and impacting kind of every corner of our planet. But also, again, it's coming back on us and infiltrating our lives in that way as well.
Yeah, microplastics are in our water and we're breathing it. Think about that, gives you anxiety.
I like that description of a solid oil spill. It's something I hadn't really considered before, but it really encapsulates it really gets the idea across that plastic is really bad for us.
Yeah, I'm curious about, is there something that sticks out in your mind as like the most egregious, unnecessary use of plastic that you've seen recently?
Oh, geez, where to start? Where to start? I mean, I feel like every time I go into a, like a quote unquote normal grocery store, not that it is normal, but what we deem as a normal grocery store, as opposed to those that are working to reduce packaging, for example. Yeah, it's the produce, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
sitting on like a styrofoam tray, then covered in plastic. I mean, there are a lot of different examples of it. Often the produce like has its own protective skin. It's just so interesting to me that as a society, not across all cultures, but many have, relate something wrapped in plastic as more sanitary as something that isn't. Yeah. So I think I find some of that stuff really egregious. Like just the totally, just it has its own packaging, Bananas, I think, are a good example of that.
For sure.
When bananas come wrapped in plastic, that's the most face palm of them all, I feel like.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah.
I once saw a set of avocados that were wrapped. They were on a styrofoam tray and then wrapped in plastic.
Yeah,
I see that all
why?
the time. Yeah, they're trying to sell them as a group of 3, and it's like, hey, they're ripe. I'm like, I can pick up a ripe avocado on my own, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Totally, yeah. Yeah, but also like, you go into a coffee shop, not only is it a single-use cup, but then it's like double cupped. And then there's also like a sleeve on it, like a paper sleeve. And then it's just like all, the little plastic stir stick, and then the little cup, like the lid, and then, and the list goes on. It's like all just for one beverage that's probably going to be consumed in like less than 10 minutes. And all of that pointless packaging goes into that one beverage. I also find that totally mind-boggling.
Greenpeace have you guys been engaging with some of the major coffee chains? I'm curious to know how that's going, if so.
We have been. And I would say that the conversations are mixed. There's definitely, I would say, finally a recognition of a problem. So that's, the first step. Sort of the more public recognition of the problem, because, let's be honest, these companies have known for a long time that they generate a lot of waste. I think it's only, though in recent years that images of their products in the actual environment and their contribution to the plastic pollution crisis and the waste crisis has really been brought to light. And so I think they realize that it is a PR nightmare. But at the same time, we haven't seen the leadership that we hoped we would see. It seems pretty obvious that these companies, since they're, when it comes to a company like Tim Hortons or Starbucks, there's literally, a restaurant almost in every neighborhood, or at least in every community, especially when it comes to Tim Hortons. You would think that they would innovate in a way that creates a model of reusables that works for the customers and for the planet, because they're well set up for that. You can get a coffee in Saskatchewan, and if you're doing a road trip, you can drop it at a Tim Hortons, on your way into Vancouver. If you were to do sort of like a deposit return scheme that we've seen at a smaller scale in a bunch of different cities around the world. But it's, as I say, it's been really disappointing to see that there's been so much focus by these companies on continuing their disposal-centric model. So, we'll make our cups allegedly recyclable, or we'll try to make them from a compostable material. But essentially, they're just perpetuating the same throwaway model, and they're not actually thinking about ways to continue to, support their customers in their coffee experience, but at the same time, not generating, millions and millions and millions of essentially pieces of trash, and then often pollution every week of every month of every year for decades.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned something interesting, which is like the focus on recyclables and biodegradables. Wondering if you could tell me why those aren't good solutions to the plastic pollution crisis.
Sure. So, like going back to what I just said, which is that it just keeps perpetuating this same throwaway model that isn't working for us. So, right now we exist in a linear economy where we take something from the natural environment, we make something, it then gets turned into waste, and then we repeat, like take, make, waste, linear model is what we operate in. And whether it's plastic or, paper, it's all the same waste generating, pollution contributing model. And so we know that that isn't working, like across the board, how much waste overall we generate as, a global society, how much pollution we're creating, how we're just destroying, forests and extracting oil and polluting and all of it. None of it's working. So we really need to move away from an extractive model, and we need to keep things in a loop. Like if we have a material, we need to be able to use it ideally for the rest of time in some format. And so when we've seen a lot of companies and even governments really, try to point to other disposable alternatives as a solution. But when it comes to paper, questions like, is it contributing to deforestation? Like, what is the source of that paper? A lot of bioplastic still has petroleum in it, or it's made from another material, often corn. Is it coming from a harmful industrial agriculture operation? These are all questions that often aren't asked. And so, that product, that alternative could be creating just another environmental problem. But then when you look at, okay, cool, you allegedly have created not cool, but that's what the companies are saying. Cool, look at us, we have a compostable cup. It's like, okay, so where's that going? And the reality is that a lot of the municipal composting facilities can't take bioplastics or a lot of different types of allegedly compostable packaging. So it's actually, those products are going to landfill anyway. So it's not having a better outcome. And also there's a lot of confusion, understandably, by customers, by the public, of what do I do with this compostable thing? Is it compostable in my own composter? Is it compostable at the city? Can I recycle it too, even if it's compostable? Will it be recycled? There's so much confusion that basically we're just creating a different type of waste at this point, and often pollution. We did a beach cleanup and brand audit last year.
Was that where you sort of look for like what brands have trash on the beach, or?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So we essentially it's looking at the companies that are responsible for the branded pollution that you find. And we've created a top 5 polluters list in Canada, but we've also done it globally in collaboration with a bunch of other different organizations. But the thing that was interesting that we were really paying close attention to last year was that, we've seen companies like Coke that owns Dasani water bottles. You may have noticed on the Dasani water bottles, it's like, 30% or something plant-based. But that doesn't make a difference if it's in the environment. It's still, it's still polluting. It's still either being recycled or not. Like, it's not, it doesn't really do anything. And even when we would find, say, a paper straw or a allegedly compostable cup, they were still polluting. It still takes however long for those to break down in the environment. And a lot of them actually are only designed to break down in industrial composting facilities. They're not designed to break down in the actual natural environment. So all of that to say that we really need to be moving away from disposables as a group. And single-use plastics are currently the most problematic of that group, but they're all problematic. And we really need to be looking for reusable or just no packaging at all, depending on what the good is. We need to be looking at those kinds of solutions and not just thinking we can swap out one disposable with another, and that there you go, you've ticked the box.
I'm curious, from brand audits like this, what are some of the worst offenders when it comes to plastic pollution?
So Nestle is always I guess I'll kind of mix the global results and the results in Canada. But Nestle is always, in the top of the list. Coca-Cola is always in the top of the list. In Canada, Tim Hortons is always top of the list. They were second in 2019 for the second year in a row. McDonald's comes up a lot, Starbucks, PepsiCo, and then we've seen Unilever and I believe Procter and Gamble. Those are other big players. It's kind of who you would expect when you think about walking through through your community and potentially seeing garbage cans on the streets overflowing. I mean, I can just walk up my street here and outside of a Tim Hortons or a Starbucks, I mean, the garbage cans are just overflowing. And bottle caps, you so often see Coca-Cola or Pepsi or Gatorade or whatever bottle caps in the environment. So it's kind of all the brands that you would think, because they're very present just in our, in our everyday lives.
Yeah. I'm curious about, in terms of the shift away from single-use plastics, are there any initiatives that get you sort of excited, or any that you think are really interesting?
Yeah, definitely. We've seen a number of zero waste or bulk refill unpackaged grocers open up across the country. And I find those really exciting because they've gotten a lot of interest. There's really been, a hunger for people, no pun intended, for that kind of model. And they're doing really, really well. And they're always, in my experience and speaking with them or engaging with them, they're always trying to continue to improve and push the bar. It's not like they're all squeaky clean, the ideal model of circularity and zero waste, but that's also because they operate in a non-circular system. And it's been really interesting hearing about the challenges that they face in terms of sourcing product and, the different things that they've had to go through in order to try to offer legitimately zero waste or unpackaged goods, as opposed to just, having it be zero waste or unpackaged in the store itself for customers, which is two very different things. But those initiatives, offer hope, because there's a lot that can be learned from them to scale up those kinds of models and have the larger grocery chains adopt certain elements of those models and employ them so that more people can have access to zero waste and unpackaged, more sustainable, more socially responsible options. Because that's the big issue now, is that it's really, you really have to go out of your way to truly dodge plastic in your daily life. A lot of people don't have the time or the means or the energy or the access. So we really need to look at models that are scalable and scalable quickly, because this problem is getting worse every day. But there are lots of those around us if sort of major players would actually adopt them, and if governments would actually incentivize those more circular reuse, refill, unpackaged models, as opposed to subsidizing, petrochemical and plastic production, which is what has been happening.
Yeah, I'm curious, sort of on the government side, what are the kinds of things that you're calling for? Do you think, should governments be going for like plastic bans right now, or should they be focusing on like taxing straws and things like that? Or what's your approach?
Yeah, they should really be putting bans in place. They should have done it a long time ago. We have seen some governments around the world that have had, bans in place for quite some time on certain particularly problematic items, but we're not seeing like a comprehensive approach, which is what is really needed, and it's needed now. We know that plastic is toxic. It's toxic to wildlife. It's toxic to the environment. It's toxic to ourselves. And, the government, for example, in Canada, under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, it lists toxic substances under this act and then regulates the production or consumption, distribution of those toxic chemicals. And so just like we saw, with the ozone, the hole in the ozone layer, and how governments all came together to ban ozone depleting substances, that's what we need to do here. There's a global plastic crisis, plastic pollution crisis, and plastic waste crisis, and governments need to come together and basically just no longer allow that toxic, polluting substance to be created. So we are really trying to push for quick action to, as I say, like start to eliminate the most problematic and unnecessary as we work towards ideally moving to a place, in a low carbon economy scenario where not only are we cutting our reliance on fossil fuels as we kind of think of them most usually, in gasoline in our cars or those kinds of things, but also cut our dependence on fossil fuel byproducts, which plastic, is one of the major lifelines that the oil and gas industry is holding on to. As a lot of global governments recognize, okay, well, we at least need to do something to cut our emissions, but plastic seems to be getting off and not being associated with that. So we're still seeing investment by governments into that part of the sector. So we need bans and we need investment in the alternative, more sustainable circular models that we actually need to be moving to.
For sure. I'm curious about one refrain that we'll often hear on issues like straw bans is that it can create challenges for people with disabilities. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that issue.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a really important issue, and one that we need to be thinking about when we're talking about alternatives or the solutions. So impacted communities across the board need to be engaged in the discussion of solutions. And, for example, when it comes to straws, people with disabilities who require a straw and who feel as though plastic is the best alternative for them, they should totally have access to a straw. And so, when we talk about bans of single-use plastics, of course, we need to be mindful of those exceptions and those areas that we need to address. So, it isn't about, just this like blanket approach and not considering the exemptions or exceptions. It's about looking at the main source of the problem and how we can address the bulk of that waste generation and eliminating that. So, most straws are unnecessary and some straws are necessary. And so if we eliminate the most that are unnecessary, then those ones that are necessary are no longer a problem. That's kind of how we need to be looking at it. And, that's going to come up when it comes to a lot of different non-essential plastics, because people have relied on them for different reasons. And also they, in some ways they have, of course, like served a purpose and they've replaced other things because plastic does have its qualities. We've definitely seen that in the medical community, but we at the same time know that there are alternatives or there are the potential for alternatives that could meet the same needs and tick the same boxes, but that aren't potentially derived or created from plastic. So yeah, it's really about making sure that we're having all of the right people in the conversations when we're talking about what the solutions look like and what needs need to be met for those solutions.
Great. I'm curious because it's July, and so for listeners that might be trying Plastic-Free July, do you have any sort of tips on what some of the best approaches might be to either eliminating or reducing plastic use in their lives?
So I've definitely personally participated in Plastic-Free July. Of course, we've done it. Greenpeace has participated in Plastic-Free July in different ways, but I've personally done it as well. And, experience a lot of the same challenges that many other folks are experiencing as they're trying to cut their plastic footprint. I guess some things that, if you're going to really go for the gusto and try to, not completely eliminate plastic from your life for the month of July, that's a major undertaking. And it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of research. It's going to be really interesting and really informative and also not sustainable in our current system. So, one of the big things I would say is like, don't get discouraged if you can't fully eliminate plastic, because it's pretty well impossible for most people to come anywhere close to doing that. But if I would say if you want to just start somewhere, just focus on a couple of items to eliminate, focus on something that seems a little bit hard and conquer it, go for, if takeout coffee is your favorite thing in the entire world, and you just can't, for whatever reason, seem to remember your reusable cup, or you don't have one, just try to do that, I would say. And if it's also the time of COVID right now. So it's also a bit challenging, but also, like what Greenpeace as an organization has tried to focus on for Plastic Free July is also this idea that, we all need to do our part. We all need to think about our consumption and how we engage with different products and the planet and people more broadly. But at the same time, like, as I've said several times, we operate in a broken system. And so there really is only so much that you can do as a person, or that, most people can do. And so the really most powerful thing that you can do during Plastic Free July is actually use your voice to tell your favorite restaurant, or to tell, that large supermarket chain, or to tell an elected official that you want something different, that you want a plastic-free option. Maybe even say to them, I really want to use a reusable coffee cup, but for whatever reason, me bringing my own cup isn't a reality for me. But I would love to be offered a reusable option. So, just engaging in a way that shows that there is support for something different. I think that's really the most powerful thing that people can do, other than obviously taking action. There are a bunch of different organizations that have a lot of calls to action that people can engage in, but either try to tackle something that helps you like really do research and change your behavior a bit that you think will last, or use your voice, I would say.
Great. And if people want to get sort of more involved in, sort of more political actions on plastic issues, what would your recommendations be there?
We, right now, actually, because for those that aren't aware, the federal government had committed to moving towards a ban on single-use plastics in 2021. So what that ban would look like, we don't know yet, but because of COVID, they've delayed that. They've delayed the announcement on that. And while theoretically they're creating the regulations that will inform that ban, we sort of don't know what the timeline on that is anymore. But there is still, a need to be moving in that direction. And so if you go to Greenpeace, I think it's greenpeace.ca/plastic, you will find different petitions that you can sign. And also you can send a letter to the federal government, send an email, a letter in email format to the federal government, urging them to not only move towards a ban, but ensure that that ban is really comprehensive, so that it's, not just banning one or two items, but actually looking at the full group of problematic and unnecessary plastics and banning the major contributors to the waste and pollution crisis. But we also, globally, we do have a toolkit, and it offers a lot of different ways that you can get involved to help tackle plastic waste and pollution at the source. And part of that toolkit is basically how to engage elected officials, and how to push for bans in your own communities or province or territory or federally or whatever the case may be. So it does offer a how-to guide if that's something that's of interest. But there are a lot of different towns and cities across the country and provinces that now have the potential for bans and other measures to reduce plastic waste and pollution on the radar. And So, even just doing a search of where you live and then looking to see if it's already a topic, and then doing a bit of research to see how you might put pressure, that would be a good way to start.
Are there any places that have sort of already acted and are doing really well on plastic bans, or is it sort of a planning stage kind of thing?
Well, it's interesting. Around the world, as I said before, there are a bunch of different jurisdictions that have different forms of bans in place, with varied success. Yeah, I guess the varied success is often related to how strong the industry is either lobbying against it or disregarding it. It sort of depends. But we've definitely seen, lots of examples of where bans of certain items have been put in place, and then we've seen either a mass reduction or elimination of that item from the waste streams, and a mass reduction in the environment. And actually, just recently, one good news story popped up in my newsfeed.
Good news in 2020? What?
I know, it was shocking. But on July 1st, it was an exact year since the Prince Edward Island plastic bag ban went into force. And so they kind of did like a reflection on the year. And what was really positive coming out of that was that they saw the total reduction of plastic bag waste from the waste stream. So it just was not part of the waste stream anymore. They saw that even though businesses were allowed to offer a paper single-use bag alternative for a fee, most uptake was of reusable bags, not of the alternative disposable bag, which is a victory. And there was really positive support from the public, really positive support from the business community, and even the Retail Council of Canada, which represents some of the big retail players, supermarket players. There was even support there saying, good, this is kind of like level the playing field, where there's clarity of what we can be doing or not doing. So it was just a good example of, there was political will, there was interest from the public, and everyone kind of worked together to eliminate, pointless plastic bags from this island province. And a lot of other provinces are looking to them, actually, following their lead and trying to learn from their example. And, we've seen some other maritime provinces or Atlantic provinces express interest in moving in that direction as well. And so, I think that's only one type of single-use plastic, but it's one that they've decided to start with. And while now we sort of, we're past the point where we really need to just be doing a piecemeal one-by-one approach, I think what it shows is that it can work. And if the goal is eliminating waste and therefore not creating the opportunity for waste to leak into the environment, it shows that bans do that. And so that, again, is why we really need to be pushing governments to move in that direction, and quickly.
For sure. You had mentioned petitions before, and one thing that I'm curious about is when an organization like Greenpeace sets up a petition and people sign it, what then do you do with it afterwards?
Yeah, so it depends on the type of petition that we're doing. So the one in support of a strong federal single-use plastics ban, that's an email. It's kind of, you sort of feel like you're filling out a petition because it's not like it's a lot of work. You don't have to write the letter yourself, but you fill in certain fields, and then that email actually goes to those people. There are other ones, if it's just you're signing your name, for example, and then, like more of the collectivism. What we often do is we sort of set a time frame as part of a larger campaign. We have a timeline of when we're, employing different tactics in a campaign. And what we often do is we'll give a petition a certain amount of time to gain signatures. And we will often communicate to the target. Often say if it's a company, we will communicate to them that the number of petition signatures is rising, or this is the number that we currently have when we're communicating with them, either publicly or directly. And then we will deliver those signatures to the company in one form or another, whether it's through, more of like a creative confrontation way, or whether it's actually just putting all of the names, on a thumb drive and delivering that to, say, the CEO or the decision maker. So it comes in a lot of different forms, I guess. But generally, the goal is to have those names, even if they're not initially, being put into a CEO's email inbox. The desire is for those names to eventually be shared, or the number of signatures shared with the company.
And do you find that that's like persuasive, that companies sort of see this many people have signed and they think, oh, this demonstrates an interest and might shape what we do? Is that a powerful tool?
It definitely can be, especially for companies that, say, aren't often the focus of, public pressure or consumer pressure, or that haven't really been in the spotlight very much. They see, it's a great way to show public support or support by, say, their consumer base for the need for them to change. Of course, there are so many different petitions across so many different issues these days. And so, we definitely hear sometimes about kind of petition fatigue, or, oh, it's just another petition or whatever. But the reality is that no matter what, it is an indicator of support on an issue. And that is something that a company or a government can't dispute. It's that many people care enough about that particular issue or want change enough to have lent their voice or lent their name to that initiative. And so, we'll often, say, engage with a company or a governmental official, and they'll note that they've seen sort of, that the number of the petition has been rising, or they're taken aback by the high number of signatures on a particular petition. So you don't always need like a million signatures to show that an issue is really worth noting. It just depends on who you're trying to communicate to, or who you're trying to change, and then kind of like gauging what level of support do you think is needed in order for it to have an impact on that decision maker or that company. What's going to make them understand that this petition it's not only this number of people that care. This is just a representation of a growing movement of people that care.
Gotcha. All right, I think that's all of the themes that I wanted to get through, but I always like to ask if there's anything that you either wish that we'd asked or that you'd like to tell us.
I think it's great that we touched on a little bit on reusables, or single use in the time of COVID, and reusables. I think one thing to note is that recently Greenpeace and this organization called Upstream worked together to get over 125 physicians, scientists, and other public health officials or experts to sign on to a statement that essentially is meant to assure customers and also businesses that reusables, when basic hygiene protocols are employed, are totally safe to be using during COVID. And that plastic is not inherently more hygienic than a reusable alternative. And that's been something we've really been working to highlight. And I think it's been a big question by the public, especially during COVID. Should I really not be frequenting the places that, have reuse or refill models? And, I think that what's been really great about this sign-on statement is it shows that, it really comes down to just proper health and safety protocols and sanitation processes. That's what it's really about. And that's, what it's always been about. That's where we need to focus. And it's not that plastic is the thing saving the day, or that plastic is the most hygienic option. So I think that's something that I think would be great to spread more widely. Yeah. And then one other thing, I guess, that's worth noting when we talk about solutions to the plastic waste and pollution crisis, I touched on this a little bit, but companies are often just trying to, find that easy swap out or that easy fix to essentially allow them to continue just to produce single-use plastic. And one thing that's been coming up a lot in industry circles and in government discussions around solutions is this idea of chemical recycling. And so some people may have seen, if they have gone to one of the big supermarket chains, Loblaw or Sobeys, that some of the water bottles, the house branded water bottles, say 100% recycled plastic, recycled content. Yeah, and we're seeing more and more of this. So it's often bottle format, but it'll say 100% recycled. So that means that it's made from, that theoretically there's no virgin oil that's gone into that plastic product. And companies are really trying to promote that as a more sustainable plastic alternative. But for one thing, chemical recycling it's a very tiny piece of the recycling sector. It's very, very tiny. It's also very costly. It's energy inefficient. There are a lot of toxic and waste residuals that come out of those processes. We don't know a lot about it. And most importantly, those processes rely on a steady stream of plastic waste into them. And then they still produce a single-use item, even though if you capture every single item and it goes back into that same thing or that same facility, then okay, you can call that a loop. But that's not the reality, because the reality is that billions of single-use items are still being produced at the same time, and collection of those items is not effective. So yeah, I just want to flag that, if folks see that 100% recycled content and think that it is a better option, yes, it does not have virgin oil in it, but it's still a single-use item that can pollute in the same way, and that is still, potentially not being recycled. So yeah, just want to flag that it's, there are a lot of things out there that look like they could be a good quick fix, but if it seems too good to be true, it usually is.
Right. Okay. So no quick fixes, no gimmicks. Got to just stop single use. Got it.
Wow. There was a lot there. Sarah, you know what you're talking about. What is it, 14 years in the industry now?
About that, yeah.
Yeah, you can tell. It's nice to hear that you're not totally demoralized having worked.
Not surprisingly, I
know. Is there a call to action that you have for anybody for Plastic Free July or just in general?
Definitely, if folks are keen to send an email to the federal government, that would be amazing. It takes like 2 seconds, and you can just go to greenpeace.ca/plastic, and you will find that take action box and others if you want to as well. But I would say that's the single most important thing that folks can do right now is support, us as a country moving in the right direction.
Nice. Yeah, I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well, so people can find that super easy. That's a really good call to action. I like it. If people want to follow us on Twitter, we are at Pullback Podcast. We've been getting some shade from the palm oil industry, so if people want to from the plastics brigade want to shade us, we'll take that too. Thanks so much for joining us, Sarah. We really appreciated talking to you today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been great to connect.